Welcome back. I'm here in a high-resolution photograph of Stratford-upon-Avon to bring you some more of the works of William Shakespeare. Last week, or year, we talked about Shakespeare's sonnets, the tormented love poems that he wrote as a side hustle. But his greatest accomplishments are undoubtedly his plays. But what is plays? Well, plays have been around for 3,000 years and they're the original medium for acting and for storytelling. Plays are like the movies, except, you know. But back in Shakespeare's time, they were really popular, and they were really good. Everyone went to the theater, and these were 3-hour shows in the middle of the day with food and drink and prostitutes and music and dance and live animals and dead animals in open-air theaters absolutely packed with people. And a different show every day of the week. It must have been a madhouse. And like a zit that you picked too much as a kid, his stories have left an everlasting mark on the face of our culture. From Othello to Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet to Dumbledore, these characters are still with us. And some of the best parts of his plays are his speeches. Now, normally a speech is something delivered on a balcony in order to get people to do horrible things in large groups. And Shakespeare did some of that too, but mostly his speeches were a way for a character to communicate directly with the audience, to explore the intricacies of a single idea. A speech might be a way of wrestling over a really tough decision or a character trying to share an emotion that they're feeling. Occasionally, it was just killing time while the little boy playing the leading lady had to run backstage and squeeze into a wedding dress, but a lot of the time, it really feels like both the character and even Shakespeare himself are trying to understand something with us. Just like how we might need to talk out a big emotion or a complicated problem with friends or even with strangers, these speeches and soliloquies are a way of sharing a human experience, asking a whole theater full of people to come on a single journey. They contain some of the most poignant images and beautiful language in all of Shakespeare's writings, and so that's what we'll be looking at during this next series of... For our first speech, I figured we should ease into it. Hamlet is probably the best known of Shakespeare's plays, and this is probably the best known of Shakespeare's speeches, To Be or Not to Be. In case you haven't read it, Hamlet's the story of a young lion cub from Denmark, whose father, also called Hamlet because Shakespeare wanted you to fail high school, was the king who just died. Hamlet's naturally sad about this, but to make matters way worse, his dad's brother, Uncle Scar, jumped both into the throne and into bed with Hamlet's mom, and Hamlet is really depressed. He's moping around the castle, writing sad poems and bothering his girlfriend and stuff, when he finds out that his dad's ghost has been clanking around at night, creeping out the guards. Hamlet goes to talk to Ghost Dad and learns that his murderer was, big reveal, Uncle, and Hamlet needs to avenge his father's death. This is a lot for Hamlet, who is a sensitive young man and who would like to just go back to college. So he goes a little stupid and he acts like a crazy person whenever anyone's watching. When he's alone, however, he talks to us, the audience, because we paid to get into the theater. He does a lot of talking. And this speech comes at one of his lowest, most confused moments. Hamlet is a really interesting character, and I don't know why exactly it is that he is so captivating, but there's something about him that really lets people step into his shoes. And even 400 years later, he's about as human and relatable as any character you can find. I think probably it's because he struggles so much. He's a good guy and he wants to do the right thing, but he's a mess. He can be stupid and bratty and vain and cowardly, and he really does not feel up to the task that has been assigned to him. Maybe that's why so many people feel like they can recognize Hamlet. We know what it means to struggle and to doubt ourselves. And it feels comforting to see somebody else go through those troubles and have all of those worries. I think that that's why there are so many great Hamlets out there. He's kind of a mirror that everyone can find themselves reflected in. This speech comes out when problems feel insurmountable, and we confront that giant, scary idea of why we keep struggling through life. So, alrighty, let's do this. To be or not to be. You've heard this before. This is Shakespeare's most famous line from his very bestest play, and what a cool beginning. To be or not to be. It's so short. It's like Shakespeare is taking this enormous human question, the whole crux of existence, and distilling it down to the smallest verb in English. It becomes a binary question, on or off. Now, poetically, that's just really damn cool. And as an actor, it provides a suggestion for how to perform it. Keep it small. When people deliver this line like it's some huge thing,
to be or not to be,
it seems like that's the opposite of the point. It's not this grand, elaborate thing. It's this small, inescapable thing. To live or to die.
a fish flapping on the carpet and a fish not flapping on the carpet.
So, to be or not to be is the thesis of the speech, but it's also setting up a classic Shakespeare technique, antithesis. Antithesis is setting two images or ideas against each other, in this case whether it would be better to live or to not live. Everything that follows will argue for one side or the other. Also, check this out. A normal line of Shakespeare is iambic pentameter, which means that it's broken up into 5 chunks, or feet, each with an iamb, an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed one, da-dum. So a normal line would be, when I consider everything that grows, 10 syllables all going da-dum, 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 da-dum. It's got a nice strong ending. But the first few lines of Hamlet's speech have an extra beat, which makes them 11-syllable lines, also known as
hendecasyllabic.
You see, all these lines end on a weak note. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer, outrageous fortune, a sea of troubles. These are known as trochaic endings because they end with a trochee, and also as feminine endings because they're weak and frail and get paid 80 cents on the dollar or whatever. They were named that by the Victorians, and these are the same geniuses who invented phrenology and rubbed arsenic on their faces. But Shakespeare probably did use them to imply that Hamlet was losing his resolve. It's worth comparing it to Sonnet 20, which is all about the poet's special little buddy having feminine traits, which has entirely trochaic endings. Whatever Shakespeare intended, it can still spark an idea for the actor. Maybe Hamlet is lost and uncertain, and uses this speech to muster his strength or to comfort himself. Okay, now let's look at the other half of the line. Most of the time, this line is said, to be or not to be, that is the question, which makes perfect sense. But I think we have a kind of a cool opportunity here, because 400 years later, most of the audience will know this line. The actor walks on stage and says to be or not to be, and everybody will think that is the question. So Hamlet can respond to them. That is the question. Now, not only does that fit the meter a little better, but it connects to the audience. It brings them along. Obviously, there's no way that Shakespeare intended this unless he could time travel, but what the playwright intended is really only one piece of the puzzle. We also have to consider what the actor and the director are trying to express and what the audience needs to experience. Theater is a collaborative art form, and if Shakespeare didn't exactly intend it, well, fuck him, he's dead. Okay, so we've done the first line. We should probably move on. Now Hamlet delves deeper into the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. Well, so what's that mean? He's asking whether it's better to live, even if it means suffering all of the slings and arrows, the pain and agony of outrageous fortune, of an absurd, unjust life, or would it be better to take up arms, to fight back against our troubles, and by opposing, simply by standing up to them, to end them? Should I keep struggling or end the pain? For Hamlet, the answer is obvious. Look at the words that he uses around life. Suffering, slings, arrows, outrageous, a sea of troubles. It might be noble to live, but it's only nobler in the mind. On the other hand, killing ourselves, according to Hamlet, is an act of courage, and it simplifies everything. Cheerful. Also kind of weird that he uses this mixed metaphor. Take up arms, but then against a sea. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. But it reminds me of the story of King Canute, everyone's favorite. An ancient king that brought his throne out to the seaside and commanded the tide to stop rising, which, spoiler, it didn't. We can't control nature. But Hamlet is saying that the way to defeat the Sea of Troubles is actually simple. Death. Moving on, check out how the rhythm shifts. You see how all of these lines are really flowy, lots of longer words and not much punctuation, and then suddenly, to die, to sleep, no more. It's curt and short and monosyllabic. That's good poetry. It makes your ear wake up and listen. Actors tend to keep an eye out for monosyllables as they're often cues to take our time. Also, these words are verbs, to die, to sleep, and Shakespearean schmactotypes are always on the lookout for verbs. Verbs are action words and carry a lot of the meaning of a line or a thought. To suffer, take up arms, end them. Hit your verbs and it'll convey the idea to the audience. And this idea is kind of beautiful. To die, to sleep. He corrects himself. Maybe to take the sting off of it, maybe for himself, maybe for the audience. He needs comfort, just to sleep, no more. And he softens it further by asleep, to say we end the heartache. Doesn't sound so bad. We end the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. If you're like a student watching this, your flesh probably isn't saggy and dying yet, but I can tell you, it's no fun. Then he sweetens death even further. It's a consummation devoutly to be wished. Consummation can mean just an ending or a coming to perfection, but it can also refer to the sexy times that make a marriage official. It's devoutly to be wished. To die is something pious, something holy, a union that we should desire. In one clause, we have sex, death, and religion. This guy's a good writer. Check out this question mark in the middle of this line. Actors also tend to keep an eye out for punctuation, especially ends of sentences in the middles of lines. We call these mid-stops, and instead of a pause, they're usually more like a springboard, a cue to launch into the next thought. We even have another mid-stop right in the next line, a clue that Hamlet is letting these ideas rush out. When this punctuation occurs at the end of a line, we call it, and you'll never guess this, an end stop. And that's when you can take a pause and really let the stuff sink in. There's only one end stop in this whole speech, which is a really good suggestion that it has a lot of energy and that we shouldn't stand around pausing and thinking all over the place. And see, again, this has some of that more sustained rhythm to it. Another clue that we should let these ideas flow out. But then, again, we get that short monosyllabic rhythm, to die, to sleep. It recalls the little soothing mantra that Hamlet found for us a second ago. But there is trouble at mill. Hamlet breaks into the second major part of this speech, the problem. Because if we sleep, we might dream. Aye, there's the rub. Rub just means problem. It comes from the great game of bowls. No, not bowling, which is fun, but bowls, which is English. Rub refers to obstacles in the way, but the sport also employs terms like wood and jack and kitty. Good clean English fun.
Freshen the drink, Governor!
So why are dreams a problem? Because in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off our mortal coil, i.e. when we've died, must give us pause. So if death is like sleep, then imagine what the nightmares are like. Hamlet, despite being really cool, is really religious, and these guys have a pretty specific policy on suicide. So that thought must give us pause. Now this is the only short line in the whole speech. Unlike the normal 10 syllables, this line only has 8. That usually means take a pause and let those extra beats just hang in silence. The line also literally says, give us pause, so it's essentially a stage direction. Remember, Hamlet wants to die. But the idea of dreaming after death is the respect, the other thought that makes calamity of so long life. Oh look, it's a Shakespeare double meaning. We get a lot of these. It could mean that it makes our calamities, our problems, have a long life, or it could mean that having a long life is a calamity. As an actor, it's dangerous to try and convey both meanings at once. It's better to pick one that you prefer and let the audience pick up on the other meaning. And nobody will care anyway, so it really doesn't even matter. All of these are arguments for but here Hamlet pivots mid-sentence back to the arguments against life, with this list of the whips and scorns of time, all the horrible things that we're forced to endure. The oppressor's wrong, which means like idiots in charge. The proud man's contumely, which is smug people saying smug things. The pangs of disprized love. Have you ever been in love? It's terrible. The law's delay.
911, what's your emergency?
The insolence of office. And the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes. This one's a bit tricky. It means the spurns, the insults that patient people take from unworthy people. Basically, life is filled with difficulty, injustice, and pain. Compare this to Sonnet 66, the suicide sonnet, which has a very similar list. It's kind of cool. Shakespeare loves his giant lists, and as an actor, the challenge is making each thing on the list sound individual and spontaneous. This whole depressing catalog is another argument for death. To return to the beginning of the thought, who would bear all of this when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Quietus comes from one of them Latin phrases, meaning it's at rest. It's a phrase that was used when a debt was settled, implying that death repays a debt, creates balance, and it could be done with a bare bodkin. Bodkin could mean a small dagger, but it could also mean a little sewing needle or a pin. And just like Richard II's speech about death, it comes with a little pin, bores through his castle walls, and farewell king. All it takes to end this massive sea of troubles is a little scratch.
If you pierce them, the water leaks out, and they die.
And who would Fardels bear? Who would carry this heavy burden to grunt and sweat under a weary life? He goes from schmancy Latin phrases to really visceral, vulgar verbs. Grunt, sweat. Hamlet is trying to talk to the audience, who would have known all about grunting and sweating, and make them realize that they are in the same boat that he is. No one would continue living except that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. We would all rather put up with what we know, even if it's painful, rather than face what might come after death, the undiscovered country. Makes it sound spooky, but it's also kind of alluring. But the dread comes from the fact that no traveler returns. Except for, like, your dad, apparently, like, it was like a few scenes ago. Shakespeare does some cool things to bring out the music in this passage. We have these shifting rhythms again, but also there's some alliteration and dread, death discovered, the internal rhymes like will and ill, and then a steady descent into monosyllables, ending with the speech's only end stop. Now, an end stop can be treated like a real pause to let the thoughts sink in for Hamlet and for the audience. That pause leads into the third and final section of this speech. Hamlet's introduced the question, posed a problem, and now he needs to find a conclusion. And this last section begins with thus, ready to bring us home. His conclusion is conscience does make cowards of us all. More alliteration there, see that? Every one of us is just a coward because fear of death makes us endure our drab, wretched lives. He repeats the phrase, and thus, a clue that he needs to be conclusive, to decide for sure that he, and all of us, are in fact cowards. He's answering a question that he asked in a previous speech. He says that the native hue of resolution, cool bit of assonance there, hue of resolution, is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action. He's saying that our thoughts, our fears, our doubts all cast a pale shadow on our resolution and prevent us from ever taking action. He stopped asking questions and he's trying to come to a conclusion. He wants to feel certain because right now his head is filled with doubt and fear, overthinking everything until he's paralyzed. And maybe that's why he's trying to figure this whole question out with the audience. Thought is contrasted with action. We all know the difference between planning for ages and never doing anything, or just leaping into action.
Oh my god, he just ran in.
It's the same contrast between overthinky, fretting, walk in circles annoying the servants, charming Prince Hamlet, and Laertes, who, when he needs to avenge his dad, just kicks the door down, guns a-blazing. Hamlet can't do that. He needs to think and talk and sulk first. I guess that's why everybody likes him? I don't know. But he's a person who wants to be what he is not. Every speech has to have some purpose, something that it's attempting to change. Hamlet is trapped in a prison of his own thoughts. He's been given a mission, but he can't seem to step up to the plate. He's trying to face himself, and I think that's why this speech is so universal and so timeless. It's a problem we've all faced. How and why should we live a life with so much pain and heartache? Why even get up in the morning? Even if we love our lives and don't have creepy uncles banging our moms and ghost dads haunting us, to be or not to be hangs perpetually over our heads. The conclusion that Hamlet comes to here is not very encouraging. But luckily, I think it's a premature answer. He comes to his proper conclusion at the end of the play, just before he fulfills his mission and finally meets his own death. He doesn't choose to be or not to be, but simply let be. And whatever that means, I think it's a much wiser answer. Alright, so we have our text. Let's try and put it all together. So, Hamlet walks out on stage, alone, more or less, and he talks to the audience. To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more. And by asleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of? Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action. Oh crap, Ophelia's here. Quiet. Hello. Okay, well, I think I've talked about enough for today. So tune in next time when we will look at something else. Thanks for watching.